Today, we are going to dive deep into one of the most surreal and tense episodes in recent Latin American history. A moment when one social media post from a U.S. president seemed to cut an entire country off from the sky, and when Nicolas Maduro, isolated and surrounded, reacted in a way that many observers called simply unbelievable. To understand what really happened when Donald Trump closed the skies over Venezuela and how Maduro responded, we first need to go back a few years and understand the slow-motion collapse that turned Venezuela from one of the richest oil producers in the world into a country on its knees. Only then does the scale of this confrontation and the risk it carried for the entire region really make sense. For decades, Venezuela was known above all for oil. With the largest proven oil reserves in the world, the country once financed generous welfare programs, subsidized fuel, and projected influence across Latin America. But years of mismanagement, corruption, and a dangerous dependence on oil revenues left the economy extremely vulnerable. When oil prices fell and government controls strangled the private sector, what followed was a spiral of hyperinflation, shortages, and institutional breakdown. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines, supermarket shelves emptied. Ordinary citizens queued for hours to buy a bag of rice or a little cooking oil. Out of this chaos, Nicolas Maduro, the chosen successor of Hugo Chavez, tried to maintain a revolutionary image while relying more and more on repression. Over the years, international organizations, human rights groups, and many governments accused his administration of rigging elections, imprisoning opponents, and crushing protests with brutal force. More than 7 million Venezuelans eventually left the country, creating one of the largest migration crises in the world. And it is on this background of collapse and repression that the United States, under President Donald Trump, began to treat Maduro not as a normal head of state, but as something much closer to a criminal target. Washington's rhetoric hardened step by step. U.S. authorities accused high-ranking Venezuelan officials, including generals and people close to Maduro, of being involved in a drug trafficking network often referred to as the Cartel of the Suns. In U.S. indictments and statements, this alleged cartel was not just about personal enrichment. It was described as a parallel criminal structure embedded within the Venezuelan state itself, using military infrastructure and diplomatic channels to move narcotics and launder money. In that narrative, Maduro was no longer simply an authoritarian president. He was painted as the political head of a transnational criminal organization. This shift in framing was crucial. Once a leader is no longer seen as a legitimate president, but rather as the head of a cartel, or even a terrorist-like organization, the kinds of tools considered acceptable to use against him changed dramatically. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, asset freezes, legal indictments. All of this became part of the pressure campaign. The goal, from Washington's perspective, was to squeeze Maduro until he either accepted a political transition or fell from power. Then, according to accounts that circulated among analysts and commentators, came a moment that felt as if it had been pulled from a political thriller. It was late November. Maduro had just celebrated his birthday, surrounded by loyalists, and still projecting the image of a confident leader in control. But behind the scenes, something very different was taking shape. Donald Trump, we are told, placed a direct call, or at least sent a very clear message through diplomatic and intelligence channels, with a brutal and simple ultimatum: Choose a country for exile and leave power, or face consequences. The options reportedly floated were countries not known for their warm ties with Washington: Russia, Turkey, Iran. Places where former leaders under U.S. pressure might find some protection from extradition. In other words, the message was, your presidency is over. Now the only negotiation left is where you want to spend your exile. Maduro, however, allegedly tried to negotiate. He is said to have asked for guarantees that he could retain some influence over the armed forces, some degree of protection for his inner circle, perhaps even a role in shaping the post-Maduro political landscape. From the U.S. perspective, this was unacceptable. A regime accused of massive corruption, human rights abuses, and drug trafficking could not be allowed to keep one hand on the country's future after leaving office. The response was essentially no. There would be no half transition. It was all or nothing. The ultimatum, according to this narrative, expired without agreement. Maduro stood his ground, and that was when Trump took a step that shocked many observers, not so much because of what was decided, but because of how it was done. There was no dramatic speech at the United Nations. There was no formal resolution from an international body. There was, instead, what has become one of the defining tools of modern politics: a post on social media. With a few lines and a click, Trump announced what he described as the closure of Venezuelan airspace, or, more precisely, he signaled that the United States considered the skies over Venezuela a risky zone due to potential military operations. It sounded almost like a digital decree, a no-fly zone declared not from the floor of an international institution, but from a smartphone. Of course, strictly speaking, the United States cannot physically seal the skies over another sovereign country with a social media post. But what it can do, and did, is instruct its own aviation authorities to issue urgent warnings. The Federal Aviation Administration moved quickly to publish advisories for airlines and pilots, highlighting the risk of potential military activity, GPS interference, and heightened danger in Venezuelan airspace. For airlines that fly into or over the region, such warnings are no small matter. Insurance companies demand that they take them seriously. Flight safety departments reevaluate routes overnight. The result was that major international carriers began to suspend or reroute flights to Caracas and other Venezuelan destinations. In practice, while Venezuelan airspace did not literally disappear from the maps, it started to look like a blank space on many airline route planners. Planes that once flew over the country began to curve around it. Some flights that used to connect Venezuela directly to major global hubs were canceled or sharply reduced. For the ordinary Venezuelan already living through shortages and isolation, this closure of the sky was one more layer of separation from the world. It made it harder for people to travel, for families to reunite, for business connections to be maintained. It also affected neighboring islands and countries. Caribbean destinations like Aruba, Curaçao, and Bonaire had to adapt flight paths, sometimes making trips longer and more expensive, simply to avoid the potential conflict zone that Venezuela suddenly represented. But the story does not stop in the air. While the digital curtain descended over Venezuelan skies, something much more concrete and visibly intimidating was happening at sea. The United States launched a major deployment in the Caribbean, an operation that has been compared to some of the largest U.S. naval mobilizations in the region
since the invasion of Panama in 1989. Officially, the mission was described in terms of counter-narcotics and maritime security. Unofficially, everyone understood that it was also a show of force directed at the Maduro regime. At the center of this deployment was one of the symbols of U.S. military might, the USS Gerald R. Ford, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, accompanied by a strike group of cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels. Alongside these came amphibious assault ships carrying Marines, forces trained not just for combat at sea, but also for rapid landings on hostile shores. Satellite imagery, open-source intelligence, and naval reports began to show U.S. ships maneuvering uncomfortably close to Venezuelan waters. One particular detail caught the attention of analysts. A U.S. destroyer, the USS Stockdale, was reported to be just about 16 kilometers from the Venezuelan coast at one point, well within sight of land on a clear day. For Venezuelan radar operators, this must have been a deeply unsettling picture. American warships one step away from their territorial waters, projecting power, launching helicopters and surveillance drones, and sending a silent but unmistakable message. We can be here, and you cannot stop us. In the air, the situation was even more asymmetric.
The U.S. Air Force had F-35 stealth fighters positioned in places like Puerto Rico, perfectly placed to reach Venezuelan airspace within minutes. These aircraft, designed to evade radar and deliver precise strikes, represented a technological leap far beyond anything the Venezuelan Air Force could counter. Caracas had Russian-made Su-30 fighter jets, capable and powerful machines on paper, but limited by maintenance issues, sanctions, and logistical constraints. The difference was not just about numbers. It was about an entire ecosystem of support, training, and technology that the United States could bring to bear, and that Venezuela could not match. On land, the geometry of Maduro's options looked equally grim. To the south, Brazil had a government critical of Maduro's regime, even if it did not openly support a U.S. military intervention. Brasilia was not offering asylum, nor was it ready to confront Washington directly. To the west, Colombia was a close U.S. ally, heavily dependent on American aid and cooperation, especially in security and anti-drug operations. The idea that Bogotá would shelter Maduro was unrealistic. To the east and north, the Caribbean Sea was now patrolled by American warships. For a leader suddenly being told to leave power, the map was closing in fast. And yet, in the midst of this strategic encirclement, Maduro appeared on Venezuelan television not as a cornered man, but as a triumphant showman. In images that many found surreal, he was seen dancing to a remixed version of a song with the word "peace" repeated again and again, surrounded by supporters, waving, smiling, and projecting calm. State television portrayed him as a leader unafraid, confident that the Bolivarian Revolution would resist any foreign aggression. It was a carefully crafted image, but also one that suggested either extraordinary resolve or extraordinary denial. For his supporters, these images were proof that Maduro would not be intimidated. They pointed to history, recalling how Cuba resisted decades of U.S. pressure. They argued that Venezuela, too, would endure. For his critics, inside and outside the country, the spectacle of a president dancing while his country was being strangled from the air and the sea was an insult. How could a leader celebrate when the economy was in ruins, hospitals were desperate for supplies, and millions of citizens had fled abroad?
Beneath the propaganda and counter-propaganda, however, lay a reality that worried serious observers on all sides: the risk of an accident spiraling out of control. The United States repeatedly insisted that it did not plan an immediate invasion of Venezuela, and many analysts agreed that a full-scale intervention would be politically costly and militarily complex. But when you place powerful forces in close proximity, warships, fighter jets, missile batteries, radar systems, you create an environment where misunderstandings, technical glitches, or reckless
Actions can have enormous consequences. Imagine, for a moment, a Venezuelan air defense unit tracking a U.S. plane flying near the border. The crew is tired, stressed, possibly poorly trained. Communications are not always clear. The radar screen flickers. Someone misreads an altitude or heading. A commander, nervous and under political pressure, decides that this is an intrusion and orders a missile to be fired. In Washington, that missile launch is interpreted not as a mistake, but as a deliberate, hostile act. Suddenly, what began as a pressure campaign becomes a direct military confrontation. Similar scenarios exist at sea. A Venezuelan patrol boat misjudges distance and heads too close to a U.S. destroyer. A collision happens, or a warning shot is misunderstood. In a region full of sensors and recording devices, every move is documented and rapidly used in political messaging. "They attacked us first," one side claims. "We were defending ourselves," the other replies. The risk is not just a planned war. It is the chain reaction of small errors in a very tense environment. At the same time, the closing of the sky and the naval deployment had broader economic and humanitarian consequences. Colombia, Brazil, and other neighboring countries were already dealing with huge numbers of Venezuelan migrants. Camps had sprung up near borders. Schools and hospitals were under pressure. Local labor markets struggled to absorb new arrivals. If the situation in Venezuela suddenly turned even more chaotic, whether through an internal collapse or external intervention, those flows could multiply. Governments in the region feared not only the moral responsibility of helping refugees, but also the political backlash at home. Markets, too, were watching closely. Venezuela's oil production had already fallen dramatically, but the country still holds a symbolic and strategic weight because of its reserves. Any major disruption to what little production remained, or any move to change the ownership or control of Venezuelan oil fields, could send ripples through the global energy system. For countries dependent on imported oil, instability in Venezuela was one more source of uncertainty. Internally, the Venezuelan opposition found itself in a paradoxical situation. On one hand, U.S. pressure was weakening Maduro economically and diplomatically. On the other hand, the specter of foreign military action complicated their own struggle. Many opposition leaders did not want their cause to be associated with an invasion or a coup driven from outside. They sought a path that would combine international pressure with internal mobilization, hoping for a negotiated transition that would avoid bloodshed. But every new American ship in the Caribbean and every new threat on social media made that balancing act harder. For ordinary Venezuelans, the daily reality remained brutally simple. Whether the skies were closed or not, people still Had to find food, medicine, and a way to survive. The spectacle of geopolitical tension often felt distant from the daily struggle to get by. Yet at the same time, they were the ones who would pay the highest price if those tensions exploded. A stray missile, a miscalculated strike, or a sudden collapse of state structures would not be felt in Washington or Moscow first. It would be felt in Venezuelan neighborhoods, in the form of power cuts, water shortages, and violence. So what was Maduro's unbelievable move in this context? From one angle, it was precisely his refusal to accept exile, his decision to stay put even as the U.S. seemed to encircle his regime from above and below. In the face of an ultimatum that would have sent many other leaders packing, he chose defiance. He bet that Washington was not ready to pay the full price of an invasion, that internal divisions in the international community would prevent a unified action, and that his control over the security forces would hold. From another angle, his strategy was to embrace the image of siege. By presenting himself as the victim of imperial aggression, he tried to rally nationalist sentiment, even among some Venezuelans who were critical of his management but wary of foreign intervention. The dancing, the songs about peace, the televised celebrations, all of that was part of this narrative. We are under attack, but we are not afraid. The revolution will stand. Whether this was genuine conviction or cynical propaganda is a matter of interpretation. But as a political tactic, it aimed to transform the pressure from abroad into a tool for domestic mobilization. Looking today at that moment when Trump announced the closure of Venezuelan skies, we can see it as a symbol of a new kind of geopolitical confrontation. Instead of formal declarations and carefully choreographed diplomacy, we witnessed decisions made, or at least announced, in real time on digital platforms in front of millions of followers. A tweet or a post can move markets, shift flight routes, unsettle governments. The border between communication and action becomes blurred. At the same time, the Venezuelan episode reminds us that even in this age of digital diplomacy and information wars, traditional power still matters. Aircraft carriers, stealth fighters, destroyers, and missile batteries are not online illusions. They are real, and when they are placed close to a tense and fragile country, the risks are enormous. A regime already accused of crimes and corruption, confronted by a superpower willing to push the limits of pressure, creates a scenario in which miscalculation could have consequences far beyond its borders. In the end, Maduro remained in power, at least for the time being. The sky did not literally fall, and the feared large-scale conflict did not erupt overnight. But the structural crisis in Venezuela did not disappear. Millions of people are still outside their homeland. The economy remains damaged, institutions weakened, and political wounds deep. The story is not over. It has simply moved into a new phase. What we witnessed in that showdown between Trump and Maduro was something closer to a dress rehearsal for the conflicts of the future. Digitally signaled economic isolation, rapid military deployments, and leaders using social media as both weapon and shield. A country can be cut off from the world not only by sanctions and blockades, but also by a combination of regulatory decisions, corporate risk assessments, and viral messages. For us, watching from the outside, the lesson is sobering. We are living in a time when the fate of entire nations can be affected by the interaction between a handful of powerful individuals algorithms, and weapon systems capable of devastating force. Venezuela, with its closed skies and encircled coasts, became a stage where this new form of power was tested. And so, when we hear that a president closed the sky over another country with a post, or that another leader responded by dancing on television while warships approached his shores, we should understand that these are not just bizarre anecdotes. They are signs of a deeper transformation in how power is exercised and resisted, a transformation that will shape many other crises in the years to come.